In my previous horror game reviews, I've made it pretty clear that I'm a huge fan of classic horror design. Whether it's the tank controls, the fixed camera angles, the resource scarcity, or all of the above. Something about that combination of things adds up to the perfect formula for me. Sadly, games like this have become rather niche, and AAA studios have all but stopped making them. Thankfully though, indie studios have picked up the slack, with game after game putting the AAA scene to shame. Tormented Souls is one such indie game, with a level of visual and technical polish that will make you forget it's an indie game as you play. Despite being a fairly by-the-book classic horror game in design, it felt like a breath of fresh air, and quickly became one of the best horror games I've played in a long time. Set within the Wildberger mansion, converted internally to act as a hospital, it has everything you'd expect from a survival horror game, including some throwbacks to Silent Hill in the form of a corrupted dark world. Of course it is an indie game, so here and there you may spot some weird animations, typos, or mistranslations, but if it's doing well enough to make you forget that it's an indie game 99% of the time, I'd say that's pretty good. And the rest of the game is immaculate. We won't get into spoilers until later, but if you're looking for a quick recommendation, it's worth every penny. And with Halloween in season and a sequel recently announced, there's no better time to talk about Tormented Souls. The game starts off with Caroline, the main character, receiving a suspicious letter containing a photograph of two girls and an ominous message, resulting in reoccurring nightmares and a building obsession. To put the mystery to rest, she travels to the Wildberger mansion in search of answers, only to be knocked unconscious by a mysterious figure shortly after entering. You wake up naked in a bathtub, with a tube down your throat and one of your eyes is missing. On the bright side, both of your kidneys seem to be intact, so things could be worse. On the downside, you did just drop your bandage on the ground and then reapply it to the wound. Gross. This is where the game starts proper, and you're introduced to the controls and various gameplay mechanics like item inspection and puzzle solving. You'll also notice that the electricity is off in the mansion, and it's made clear to you that being caught in the dark is a bad idea. If you try it anyways, you'll learn that it results in you being dragged into the shadows and killed. So finding and maintaining a source of light is always a concern. The atmosphere is oppressive, and it's immediately obvious you've stumbled into something serious. I love this opening sequence. You get to see a lot of the creative camera angles and visual effects, and it does a great job of making sure you're familiar with what the game is going to ask of you before it really ramps it up. For example, that issue with the lights will be a mechanic that they play with a lot. After obtaining your first weapon, you'll notice you can't have the lighter and a weapon equipped at the same time. This means that progression in certain areas of the mansion will be locked behind your ability to either activate lights or find a better source. And some enemies will be located in rooms that are completely dark, meaning you'll have to brave the darkness in search of candles to light so you can safely equip your weapon and fight back. It's a fun way of pulling the player out of their comfort zone and pushing them into areas they'd otherwise avoid. Every time I walked into a pitch black room and heard the familiar sounds of enemies crawling and dragging their bodies around in the dark, I'd get that sinking feeling in my gut, knowing I'd probably have to go in there and find a candle. To help this along though, some enemies won't react to you if you walk slowly enough, and the game will expect you to sneak past some enemies before you're able to find candles to light, which only adds to the tension of these darker areas. I'm dwelling on the light a bit because I think it's easy to look at Tormented Souls and say it's a generic derivative classic horror game, but it brings its own mechanics to the table and plays with them in a way that keeps things interesting, even for horror veterans like myself. For another example, survivor horror games always give you some kind of melee option, the old reliable. In this case, it's a crowbar. But unlike many horror games though, even the weakest enemies in Tormented Souls take a lot of hits to die in melee. Enough to make a pure melee kill suicidal. Generally, you're going to want to soften up a target and then move in for the kill with the crowbar to save on ammo, but enemies don't stay down after a single hit. Tankier enemies might have to be downed multiple times, but if you deal enough damage fast enough, you can stun an enemy multiple times in a row and finish even the tankier ones with melee, which gives you that risky option of, do I try to get in another hit and hope it stuns him, or should I just be safe and use a couple bullets? Enemies can hit pretty hard, so if you take that risk and it doesn't work out, you can be out some medical supplies or possibly even dead. And of course, there's always the final option of just running past enemies entirely at the risk of getting hit occasionally. In the early game especially, ammunition for your weapon and medical supplies can be extremely rare, so these are decisions that you're going to have to make carefully, and it does an excellent job of increasing the tension. Throw in a couple unlit rooms and some surprise enemy encounters and you can start to see how Tormented Souls succeeds in keeping the player on their toes. It never feels overly punishing though, as enemies don't respawn after being killed. And new enemies will spawn at set points in the story, but there's ultimately a finite amount of enemies. So if you do choose to kill or avoid certain enemies, it doesn't feel like you wasted your time. It will reward you with either safe travel or conserved supplies. Complementing the gameplay is the superb sound design and music. The inventory noises have that nostalgic tone to them that instantly reminds you of retro horror games. And the clanging and growling of enemies just off screen always had me on edge. And the music is always there to help sell the moment too, from quiet tracks that build suspense, to the more aggressive tracks that know when to lay on the stress. And of course, the save room music, arguably one of the most important tracks in a game like this, is the perfect mix of comforting and off-putting. The musical equivalent of knowing that you're safe for now, but eventually you're gonna have to go back out there. I won't play the entire soundtrack here, but just know that they did a great job of making sure that the music fits the scene. And speaking of save rooms, even the saves are limited. Every save will cost you a recording tape, which are found scattered around the mansion. So not only are you juggling the natural fear of the place, the ammo, and the health kits, you've also got to make sure that you make every save count. Or you could wind up in a difficult situation knowing that you could be sent back ages if you fail. But as you improve your skills, you'll eventually find yourself without any resource issues at all, but if you ever get careless, that can always change. Just like the combat, the restrictions are never so much that the game becomes impossible to play. It's in that Goldilocks zone of adding just enough stress without being prohibitive. If anything, by the end of the game, ammo and medical supplies were almost too plentiful, but that's from the perspective of somebody who plays a lot of these games, and people that are new to the genre might not find it so forgiving. Even so, I think there's another reason why there's so many supplies in the endgame, but I'll get to that in a second. The other two pillars of classic horror design are navigation and puzzle solving. We'll handle them together since figuring out how to traverse a map and keeping track of where you've been is kind of a puzzle in its own way. Tormented Souls makes the bold choice of conveying as little information to the player as possible. Each wing and floor of the mansion has a separate map that has to be found before you can use it at will. And while it will tell you where save rooms, ladders, and locked doors are, it won't tell you which doors have been opened or which doors are otherwise inaccessible due to blockages or holes in the floor. So as you play, you really have to keep in mind what you've seen and where you've been. Many passages are blocked by wall-bound enemies that you won't be able to clear until you get certain items later in the game. So every little bit you explore and every new route you unlock will have you thinking about where you've been and where you could go next. I know this is sort of a contentious issue for some, but it really is an excellent addition to the formula. When you've got the option to avoid enemies in specific rooms, learning how to navigate the mansion is a skill that can save you a lot of trouble down the line. And for players that maybe play more recklessly and find that they didn't have enough ammo or health kits they need to kill things, finding alternate routes to get to where you need is necessary to progress safely. By the end of the game, that feeling of being able to effortlessly move from one room to the next makes it feel like you've really mastered the mansion. Some people might prefer if the map would tell you which doorways are blocked off and whatnot, but I liked the minimal approach. And by the end I had so much practice I could draw a full map of the entire mansion myself from memory. To highlight this, there's a chaser enemy you encounter later in the game. And those of you that have played it already know that it can be cheesed very easily, but I didn't know that the first time I played. This enemy is the only one in the entire game that can't be killed. She can spawn in almost any room and even in the dark world. There was a moment where she had spawned for me in a tight corridor and I didn't want to risk dodging past her because I was pretty low on health and low on supplies. But at that point, I was already pretty comfortable with the mansion's layout, so it was easy for me to head around, loop through the morgue, and be on the other side without any issues, which felt great. It's the clearest difference between being literally naked and afraid at the start and mastering the game as you progress. One of the simple joys of having to learn the navigation yourself. Like I said earlier though, that chaser enemy has its own problems, and when I figured out how easy she was to cheese, I felt a little silly doing all that looping around at the beginning. The music changes whenever it's in the room, and fun fact, I replayed this game with the music off to get footage for this review, and that sting still plays even with the music disabled. And unlike a lot of other chaser enemies, this one doesn't actually follow you from room to room. So once you hear the music, you can literally just go out the door you came in, and then re-enter the room, which will despawn it immediately. I still enjoyed my initial fear and attempts at avoiding it, but this is a mechanic that needed a bit more time in the oven. Chaser enemies aren't just there for the sake of, hey look, it's like Resident Evil. In a game where the enemies are static and finite, you kind of need that mobile, persistent threat to keep things interesting for players that have more or less figured out the rest of the enemies, or else the game can get stale. So having it be so easy to cheese just means that the later half of the game isn't as exciting as it probably should have been. This is also probably the main reason why it feels like the game has way too many supplies in the later half. I imagine the developers expected you to use some of your ammo to subdue this chaser, but because she despawns the minute you leave the room, that never really happens. So you've just got all this extra ammo to use on everything else. As a result, you can kill every enemy in the entire game with plenty of ammo and morphine to spare. The chaser was a good idea, it just needed better execution. And as long as we're on the combat, I do have to criticize the lack of enemy variety. I know it's an indie game and this studio's first game, so I won't be super harsh, but it did feel like I was mostly just fighting the same enemies over and over again. And even when you find new kinds of enemies, they don't behave any differently. Outside of a few encounters where you have the option to sneak past them, or if for some reason you don't despawn the chaser enemy and you have her chewing on your face while you fight something else, once you get a grip on the combat, it can get pretty samey. The only time I'd really get hit is if I rounded a corner and wound up in the face of an enemy I didn't know was there. It would have been nice if some later enemies required a combination of items or a different strategy. And as long as we're getting our complaints out of the way, this game uses tank controls, which I'm a huge fan of, but it makes the bizarre choice of only using tank controls if you use the D-pad, with no option to reassign it to the joystick. Now, I don't know what kind of psychopath is using the D-pad on a 360 controller, but it ain't me. And without tank controls, I was repeatedly walking into walls and doing a little curtsy as the camera angle shifted. Being able to use tank controls with the joystick would have been greatly appreciated. It never resulted in me dying, but it did get really annoying at times. That said, I did still enjoy the enemy designs, and even though the combat gets a little stale, I still found it really enjoyable. The game doesn't overstay its welcome, so by the time you've had enough, you'll likely be just about done with the game anyhow. Of course, the time it takes you to beat the game will vary greatly depending on how long the puzzles take you, so your mileage may vary. And as long as we mentioned it, we might as well go over the puzzles. Like most people with good taste, I am a puzzle enjoyer, especially in horror games, and this is no exception. Tormented Souls is bursting at the seams with incredible puzzles. I can't praise this part of the game enough. The breadth and depth of puzzles is incredible. Every nook and cranny of the mansion is packed with awesome puzzles to solve. Who designed this pipe system? Although I did have to look up some help for one puzzle in particular because it centers around the use of a floppy disk. Floppy disks were a little before my time, we'll say. Oh my god, was that it? That's all I had to do? Really? The boomers are gonna laugh at me. And unlike many horror games where unlocking a door means finding the right key, the key item in Tormented Souls is a puzzle, and finding out how to use it on each door is its own challenge. It's a clever alternative to the usual key hunt. The puzzles also make full use of the gameplay elements you encounter as you play. It's not uncommon to have to use an item you've had for ages, or dive into the dark world, or even engage in more paranormal shenanigans to shift things around. Again, I love the puzzles in this game, and there's some real head scratchers here, but if you're ever stuck, there are plenty of hints hidden in the dialogue and notes scattered around if you pay attention, even if it doesn't seem like it at first. It might even seem a little excessive, but none of the puzzles felt overly obtuse or difficult. And despite there being a lot of puzzles, it never felt like it was too much either. I know the quantity of puzzles has been a popular criticism of the game, but the quality of the puzzles alone makes them so enjoyable to interact with, and for a genre where you'd expect there to be puzzles anyways, I don't see the issue. If anything, I'd err on the side of too many puzzles as opposed to not enough, since it's not exactly like classic horror is a saturated genre. If anything, we've already got too many third-person shooters masquerading as survival horror. There's nothing wrong with leaning a little harder into your roots. Puzzles are a non-negotiable part of the formula. Without them, you'd quickly get desensitized to the horror. The downtime the puzzles give ensures that the rest of the game remains impactful. And something about encountering those bizarre, out-of-place puzzles is itself a surreal experience that has a way of reinforcing the otherworldly feeling that these horror games always have. There's a reason why it's been a staple of the genre since the beginning. Wait a minute. I feel like I've made all these points before. See, I like to watch other people's reviews before I make mine because I want to make sure that I'm adding to the conversation. And while it wasn't at all surprising, it was still annoying to see that the most common complaints about Tormented Souls was the puzzles, the combat, and the fixed camera. See, I got a lot of similar pushback in my Elisa video that I did, and look, I get it. Survival horror isn't for everybody. But it's not exactly like this is a new genre. Nothing about these games should catch you by surprise. It's on the box, so to speak. I'm just trying to imagine the mindset of the guy who hates every core design principle of classic survival horror going out of his way to buy exactly that kind of game just to complain about it. You could have bought almost any other horror game on the market and had a 99% chance of not encountering anything about classic horror gameplay. Thankfully, the few we've reviewed on this channel have done exceptionally well in spite of the standard reception these games tend to get, and Tormented Souls has already announced a sequel. But it surprises me that survival horror as a genre seems to struggle so much. Just think of how weird it is for horror fans to, on the one hand, believe that Silent Hill and Resident Evil and Dino Crisis and Alone in the Dark and countless other games made with this formula were not only amazing games for their time, but pillars of the genre that inspired decades of similar video games. But also for the general opinions of these fans to be that all of the design choices these games made should never be replicated ever again because it's all bad. I can't even really think of another genre that seems to have this problem. JRPGs are still turn-based, and RPGs in the West are still using pen and paper dice roll combat systems without much controversy. Hell, even boomer shooters are alive and well in the current era, but for some reason, survival horror in particular is stuck in this perpetual state of having to justify itself. So if you're wondering why I keep stopping to explain what such and such mechanic is for, it's because every time I think, surely people get it by now, right? I see reviews from people like this.
Why can't I angle the camera to look at the thing that's about to twat me across the room? Because it's a deliberate homage to retro fixed camera horror games. Why can't I save whenever I want? Don't blame me, blame deliberate homage. Between the gratuitous nudity, numerous plot holes, and the crazy quilt of stolen ideas, it's like there's no higher thinking behind anything in it. It also uses its soundtrack the way I use urine on a speed date, like we just flushed our earbuds down the toilet in Michael Myers' house.
First of all, that comment about the soundtrack was mean. It's a great soundtrack and it does exactly what it's supposed to. But also, these mechanics aren't there solely for the sake of homage. They're the defining characteristics of the genre. It would be like buying Call of Duty and complaining that there's too much shooting. I know, I'm seething about a video that's over 2 years old at this point, but I won't stop, and you can't make me. But now that several modern classic horror games have been made that have met with critical success, hopefully we can put this issue to rest. No, this kind of game isn't outdated, and yes, the formula still works. Like I said in my Elisa review, I'm looking forward to seeing this genre develop into what it deserves. The sequel is to be set in an entire town apparently, so we're finally breaking out of the mansions and hospitals. The future's looking bright. But that tangent aside, the only thing we haven't discussed so far is the story, which obviously means spoilers. If you've made it this far and still haven't decided if Tormented Souls is for you, it's only $20 and it's currently on sale for less. At that price, it's a no-brainer, and if it at all sounds like your kind of game, I'd highly, highly recommend it. The backdrop of Tormented Souls is the sacrificial cult, known as the Pollux sect. Through the sacrificing of twins, they hope to birth their evil god and bring back duality to the world. You're obviously one of the twins in the photos at the beginning, hence your connection to everything going on, and the old priest you meet is definitely in on it. You're probably going to guess a lot of the major story beats long before they're revealed to you in-game, but the reason I wanted to cover this story is because while the cult provides a fairly generic background, and a lot of people have rightfully criticized it, that's not really what the story's about. It's about you and your relationship with your sister, and that part I think was handled extremely well. But to comment on it, I kind of have to give a basic summary of the entire story, so buckle up for a second. The story begins long before the events of the game. Bertram Wildberger, father of Dr. William Wildberger, father of you, uncovers a book and the burial site of hundreds of twins left behind by the Tismud tribe, and later the Pollux sect cult. Consumed with a sense of purpose, he dedicates his life to resurrecting this dark god, and apparently isn't bothered by how many innocent lives he has to snuff out along the way. He builds his mansion above the burial place and sets about rebuilding the Pollux sect. The trouble is, this god requires the sacred blood of twins, and while it was fine to kidnap the locals at the start, he and his cult needed more. So they set about finding a way to reliably induce the birth of twins, and Bertram's plan to obtain test subjects for this was to burn down the local hospital and then play the savior, inviting them to relocate temporarily into his mansion, with he and the other members of the sect covering the costs of doing so. From there, they could take patients as test subjects and move them into the hidden rooms beneath the home to carry out their experiments. But it becomes clear from wandering the mansion that their attempts are largely unsuccessful. Most of the children born from their methods are deformed and die immediately after birth, and the mansion is littered with the skeletons of Siamese twins and other deformed children in tubes from the failed experiments. Eventually, unbeknownst to William, Bertram begins artificially implanting fertilized eggs into Maria Wildberger, who's your mother, without her knowledge or consent. These pregnancies predictably end in miscarriages, which takes an extreme toll on Maria's well-being. William, despite being Bertram's son, isn't a member of the cult as far as we can tell, and he doesn't know that this is going on. Eventually, after many attempts, one of these pregnancies succeeds, creating both you and your sister. But your mother has a prophetic vision when birthing you of being bitten by a snake, followed by extreme pain. Nevertheless, Maria recovers from the initial harm of the experiments, and the cult quietly plans on your sacrifice in 10 years' time, in accordance with Tismoid tradition. But as the two of you age, you encounter the Pollock sect while out playing in the woods, and Maria develops her own suspicions about what's going on. Complicating things, Bertram grows more and more attached to you and your sister, warming up to you over time and even starting to develop something of a conscience. As it turns out, it was one thing to sacrifice strangers, but killing his own grandchildren seems to weigh heavily on him. Eventually, though, the fated day comes. Noah, who is Maria's father, and the priest you meet in-game, kidnaps the two of you and takes you to the vault, along with multiple Pollock sect members, many of whom are so rotted by the corruption they've turned into walking sewage. Noah himself was born a sacred twin, but his twin died shortly after birth. Apparently, he was born within the cult and grew up feeling cheated out of his destiny of being sacrificed by the death of his brother, later deciding that this was an act of God as well, and his true destiny was to guide the Pollock sect into greatness. But before they can begin the ritual, your mother interrupts it to save the two of you. She knew that Noah had attempted to sedate her before taking you and followed him down into the basement instead. Before the cultists can close in and kill her, Bertram has a final change of heart. 10 years of watching her grow has softened him, and seeing his daughter-in-law here too was the last straw. He shoots the first cultist that tries to kill Maria and tells her to run with the two of you while it locks the vault door behind her, resigning himself and most of the cult to a miserable death underground. And when you finally enter the vault yourself, his body is the first one you find. Unfortunately, the dark god beneath emits a powerful radiation that only gets stronger as it comes closer to awakening. And while the cult members are partially protected by their radiation suits, your mother wasn't wearing one, and very quickly becomes sickened with her skin burning and blistering as you flee. While crossing a bridge in your desperate escape, she falters, and you fall over the side of the bridge into the water, while she and your sister are recaptured by Noah and brought back to the mansion. Noah believes that you died in the fall, and so he imprisons Anna and tells her that she's now useless without her twin to be sacrificed, and he leaves her to die in the cell that you find her in. While this was occurring, William was away on business, and he returns home to find his entire life in shambles. Both of his daughters are missing, and his wife Maria has a bizarre, seemingly incurable disease that renders her hostile and unable to recognize people. He starts to describe it as being more like a demonic possession than an illness, and after watching her deteriorate, he places her in a medically induced coma for her own safety and dedicates his life to finding a cure, while becoming more and more depressed at the loss of everything he cared about, his daughters most of all. Eventually, he finds Bertram's old experiment rooms, and out of desperation decides to do some experimenting of his own, kidnapping patients from the hospital above and injecting them with Maria's infected blood to give them her illness in an attempt to find a cure. To his credit, there's some indication that he was largely taking convicted rapists and criminals that were sent for emergency care, but the progress is slow. And before he can find a cure, the original hospital that burned down is rebuilt, and the patients are moved back to where they belong, taking William's access to easy test subjects with them. This is where you enter into the game. Somehow Noah finds out that you're alive, and sends you the photograph from the beginning, luring you into the mansion, only to be knocked unconscious by none other than Dr. William Wildberger, your own father. Because he doesn't know you're his long-lost daughter, he intends to use you as another test subject, as without regular access to patients, he's become desperate. In all this time, he has developed something of a cure, which we can find in-game, that will reverse the effects of the illness, but due to the damage it causes, it guarantees death within a few moments after taking it. Once you escape the bathroom, robbing William of his only remaining test subject, he takes the cure he's developed and uses it on Maria as an act of last resort, reasoning that even if it kills her, at least she'll finally be at peace. Maria, in her brief moments of lucidity, tells William that it was Noah who kidnapped you and your sister before passing away. Noah, in the meantime, had only left William alone because he needed him to develop a cure for the dark radiation. And now that he had it, even a bad one, he poisons William's wine, killing William before he can achieve his revenge. This is all happening while you're running around the mansion, and eventually you stumble into those same experiment rooms mentioned earlier, but unlock a secret compartment, revealing a set of prison cells and the skeleton of a dead child. Your sister Anna was left there to die. But you have the sacred blood of twins, and through some paranormal time travel shenanigans, you can at certain intervals travel back in time to see her, using acid to melt the chains on her cell, setting her free in the past. Only you find out that she doesn't escape. You learn later that she becomes trapped inside the sewers beneath the mansion, where she spends the rest of her life rotting away in darkness, subsisting off whatever food she can find and drinking water leaking from pipes above. Only kept sane by a single barely functioning TV that only plays a couple of local channels. And while it seems sacred twins are more resistant to the radiation that turns everybody else into monsters, they're clearly not immune, and slowly she feels her body being corrupted and changed. Eventually, Noah finds her in the sewers, and realizing that both twins are still alive, he locks Anna away in a cell at gunpoint, and sends you the letter that you received at the very beginning. If he could sacrifice the two of you, he believed, he could bring back his god and correct the mistake that he made 14 years ago. Anna, in her final act of defiance, decides that she won't let Noah access the vault that contains their god, which requires the eyes of two twins to open. Out of a combination of spite and concern for you as her sister, she pulls both of her eyes out and leaves a warning, begging you to move on, to forget about her and to live a happy life. If you haven't pieced it together, that chaser enemy, that grotesque and unrecognizable spirit that haunts the mansion is your sister Anna. After removing her eyes, she completely succumbs to the evil of the place, and wanders the mansion, attacking and eating whoever she finds. But in spite of her warning, you don't leave the mansion. After stumbling onto your old bedroom and opening the secret compartment, your memories flood back to you. Your childhood and all of the traumatic events fall into place. Determined to get into the vault and stop everything that's happening, you do the unthinkable, and travel back in time to when you were first captured and left in that bathtub so that you can cut out your own eye and use it to open the vault beneath the mansion. Noah had been waiting for this, and follows you in to open the secret compartment, confessing to killing your father before running deeper inside. Following him, you uncover what remains of the Pollock sect and Bertram's sacrifice. Creatures and masked men kept alive purely by the evil within stalk the halls, as you piece together the final bits of this story, eventually pursuing Noah to a sacrificial room where your sister is crucified. He intends to finish what he started all those years ago. Thankfully, you've been saving your ammo and mop up the remainders of the Pollock sect quite easily. If you obtain the cure from the optional room above, you can use it on your sister here, freeing her from the curse so she can finally rest in peace. With his back against the wall, Noah decides to sacrifice himself to their god as an act of faith. His blood isn't enough to birth it completely, but being a twin himself, his blood is enough to at least awaken it. And after a remarkably clunky final boss fight, you kill it and return to the surface. While thankfully somebody left their gigantic mining drill dangling precariously above it, or else I'd really be in danger, wouldn't I? If you cured your sister and obtained the bolt cutters, you can unlock the good ending now, and head back in time to when you first poured acid on her cell. Using the bolt cutters, you can set her free completely and take her with you into the present, adopting her and escaping the mansion, which seems to be the canon ending.
Anna, I'm aware that my actions were wrong. Once you find out the truth, I hope you can forgive me. Anna.
I know it's a lot to digest, but we had to cover it all so I could make my point. It's true that the God resurrection plot is a little bit derivative, and I'll also fully grant that the time travel mechanic introduces a lot of plot holes. Although, let's be honest, when doesn't time travel do that? Certain things like if your eye was missing from the start, then that kind of implies that the events that occur later during time travel always happen, even before you do them, but Anna's cell won't open until you go back in time and melt the lock, so this could actually be intentional, since the sisters are uniquely connected by their blood, and the sequel's premise is apparently that Anna develops a bizarre sickness after leaving the mansion, which prompts you to find a solution. If you get the adoption ending where you save Anna, she even remarks that she doesn't feel like she's supposed to be there. So it's entirely possible that we're not actually supposed to get away with those time travel shenanigans, or maybe twins just have a different continuity. Although if you think about it, even before you melt the lock, all of Anna's hiding places are still in the mansion, so it's probably just an oversight. We haven't mentioned it yet, but the voice acting can also be a little hit or miss at some of these story beats. Intentionally bad voice acting is kind of standard, so critiquing it is a little difficult. Although I should say, I was wrong in my Elise review. I said that the voice actors for Silent Hill 2 were intentionally bad. I was factually incorrect. My rotten soul will be thrown into the pit and my name will not be recorded in the Book of Life. I hope that I'm never forgiven for my foolish comments. Nevertheless, shifty voice acting is a staple of the genre. It's just a little off here.
What? Is this my room?
My child, you are pale. What happened to you?
A person in a wheelchair with knives in his hands was chasing me.
Oh, it's you. Don't you remember me?
Though I'll say it didn't ruin the experience at all, and the actual voices are a great fit. I think it was an issue with direction. But we went over most of the story because writing the entire thing off as being generic and bad is a mistake, I think. Outside of a few things here and there, so much of it is actually handled exceptionally well. For example, Maria struggles with the failed pregnancies. It's legitimately heartbreaking to read William and Maria's excitement over the pregnancies and subsequent sadness over the miscarriages. A miscarriage by itself is an extremely heavy topic, but it isn't just a few diary entries. One of the same rooms on the upper floors is Maria's bedroom. All over the room are her paintings, and a diary entry from where she writes about coping with loss through her art, something that remains constant in later entries. Something about the way it was written was really touching to me, the way that she blamed herself at first but found forgiveness and joy in her expression. Watching that art slowly deteriorate as the stress builds, and a reading of the way that William seemed to be genuinely loving, and even hired a maid after the first pregnancies to make sure she was happy and taken care of, even as the troubles mounted. Reading Bertram's diary and seeing him slowly warm up to the kids, or reading about the event where Anna and Emma come across the Pollock sect members from Anna's perspective, after reading Maria's entry. Maria doesn't realize what they've seen, and you get her diary entry first. In it, she's just upset that they ruined the dresses that she made, and you're left to misinterpret the reactions of the two kids. And when you finally learn what they had actually been running from, it puts it into context. A lot of the smaller events are told out of order like this, which allows you to build your own expectations before hitting you with a darker and more depressing reality. Or just look at Anna's entire story. Even before you learn about her or what happened to her, you're routinely finding beds and supplies underground, a television set, and signs that somebody had been hiding out around the place. You immediately feel sorry for whoever was stuck and living in these conditions and spend a decent portion of the game wondering who it could have been, only to learn that it was your sister the entire time. It's an impactful reveal made worse by finding her diary later on and watching her writing become more and more despondent. The way she envies and hates but still loves you as her sister, being taunted by your happiness in her dreams through your connections as twins, and remembering the faint smell of flowers outside your window before waking up in a rotten sewer. Ultimately still choosing to pull out her own eyes to keep you safe. It's an extremely touching story, and everything about it makes you want to intervene and save her. In fact, there's actually an achievement for beating the game in under 3 hours, so when I went back to replay the game for extra footage, even with the time crunch, I made sure that I saved her, and get this, I beat the game in 2 hours, 59 minutes, and 56 seconds. Not even close, baby! No child left behind. Or even look at William's story. Having everything taken from him and being forced to do the unthinkable to find a cure for the one person he has left, his wife, only to learn the truth about what's happening just a little bit too late. In the beginning, you'd think he's just a villain for almost the entire story before learning what he's actually up to and why. I could go on, but hopefully you get my point. Yeah, you can guess a lot of the big story beats from a mile away, and I guessed I was one of the twins from the very beginning, and I knew Noah was evil the minute I saw him. I mean, just look at this fucking guy. But the rest of the story is delivered in a way that's extremely compelling, and it showed a lot of tact, and it uses the environment to really reinforce certain story beats. The stories these characters have to tell is a lot more interesting than people are giving it credit for. And when you mix that in with the amazing gameplay, the incredible puzzles, and the gorgeous soundtrack, it should be pretty easy to see that Tormented Souls is an amazing game, even if some people may not think so. For this developer's first game ever to be a classic horror game at an era where people vomit at the sight of tank controls, I have to respect it for the courage alone. But the fact that they knocked it out of the park is icing on the cake. If you haven't already played Tormented Souls, give it a try. Just make sure to swap to her alternate outfit. There's exposed needles all over the place. She might not be worried about infectious diseases, but I certainly am. Long pants and boots, people. It's common sense.